You just mentioned it. You go, oh, well, I've had it for years. I've watched it 100,000 times.
Was that a go? Hi, I'm Chris Doglemar, the Executive Director for the Center for Social Innovation here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Welcome to all of you who are joining us on YouTube for our guest presentation in our new CSR course here at the GSB. This new course, Social Innovation Through Corporate Social Responsibility, is taught by Professor Dave Brady and me. We are honored and thrilled to have Deborah Dunn as our guest tonight talking about stakeholder theory. Deborah is a member of the faculty at the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design here at Stanford, also known as the D School. Deborah is spearheading new efforts on coursework as well as projects on new issues around sustainable abundance. She is an advisor to startups and social ventures all over the globe. She sits on the board of the Skoll Foundation, B-Lab, and Global Giving. In addition to all those leadership activities, Deborah is here tonight to talk to us based on her career as an executive with Hewlett-Packard for 22 years. Deborah's most recent position was as a Senior VP of Corporate Affairs and Global Citizenship. Prior to that, she was VP of Strategy and Corporate Operations. Deborah has worked at HP in the manufacturing division, led teams in human resource, marketing, and it's that diverse skill set across corporate division that gives her a unique perspective as we talk tonight about stakeholder theory and corporate social responsibility. Deborah got her BA at Brown. She got her MBA at that other school on the East Coast that Stanford doesn't like to talk about. Harvard. I've been fortunate to know Deborah personally and professionally for the past few years. And I find whenever I'm at one of those strategic crossroads, I call Deborah. She is at the top of my list of people whose advice I seek out. And what I find with Deborah is she has an uncanny and gifted ability to take global changes, emerging trends, political forces, synthesize that material and make it relevant to the choices you're making for your organization. And I find whenever I leave with Deborah, I have one of those aha moments. I feel I'm on a better strategic path. And in sum, a half hour with Deborah is much more valuable than many hours with a multitude of executives that I've spoken with. And so with that, welcome Deborah Dunn. And we're getting set up now.
Well, Chris, thank you for that very generous introduction. It will be hard to live up to the expectations you set, but I'll give it my best. So first, I just wanted to anchor my comments in a little bit of context about my background and experience and how I've come to my point of view. So I think significantly, I grew up in a blue-collar family. I was the first in my immediate family to go to college. I went to Brown. At Brown, I studied comparative economics. I was really interested in trying to find an economic form that allowed for more democratic participation. And I actually ended up writing a thesis on consumer co-ops and working in the co-op space when I left Brown in a nonprofit organization that did consulting and training with food and housing co-ops all over the US and Canada. After spending a little bit of time in the nonprofit space, I got a little frustrated with the pace, the lack of the kind of progress that I was looking for. So I moved back to Boston. I'd spent a little time in Michigan working in the nonprofit world, moved back to Boston, worked for the Massachusetts government for a year, actually running an energy conservation program, which I now find kind of amusing, given the way we've gone full circle on that topic, in the low-income community, doing basically housing upgrades, low-cost housing upgrades to reduce energy consumption in the low-income community. If I had been frustrated by the pace of progress in the nonprofit world, I was incredibly frustrated by the pace of progress in government. I was actually working for a former Brown professor who had gone to work for the government, really excited about having a mandate to drive change. And I encountered lots of people in the organization who'd been there a long time, were quite clear that they would be there long after he left, and that he was not going to have a lot of impact on the way they lived their lives on a day-to-day basis. So really eye-opening experience, but it led me to decide business had all the money, business had all the power. If you really wanted to have an impact, you had to go into business. So I got into Harvard, got my MBA, and when I graduated, I first of all wanted a legitimizing credential. I'd had this sort of weird, broad range of experience. And I also wanted to work for a known company that I felt I could really resonate with from a values perspective. Hewlett-Packard was a company that at that time was getting lots of visibility, lots of notoriety for the HP way and for the values of Hewlett and Packard. And that all resonated with me. I interviewed there. I got a job expecting to be there for about 2 years. And I left in 2005, 22 years later, having enjoyed an incredibly broad and diverse career, primarily in line management. So at the division level, I managed most functions, marketing, manufacturing, human resources. I ran a division. I was Lou Platt's chief of staff. I had a bunch of corporate functions after Carly came in, including strategy and communication, as Chris mentioned. And then my very last job was as an officer of the company and a member of the executive council, running everything related to global citizenship. And that was a very interesting and exciting opportunity at an exciting time to have that kind of visibility in the mainstream corporate world. So on this whole topic of stakeholder theory, before I get into the details of HP, to me, there are a couple really simple questions that are at the heart of all this. The first and most obvious is, whose interests should a company serve? Should it be the global community? Should it be the local community where the company actually has physical operations? Should it be partners of the company? Supply chain partners, other partners? Should it be employees? Should it be customers? Should it be investors? Should it be all of these? Should they have the same weight? Should shareholder primacy actually be the mode? That's sort of the current thinking in many business circles, that the shareholder is number one by a long shot and others get factored in as it helps fuel profit. At the end of the day, this really is the question. And I think in pursuing a career in business, it's important to understand how you answer that question and why. The other big question is, over what time frame should you be thinking about the interests of all of these various stakeholders or players? Should you be focused on the next quarter, the next fiscal year, your option vesting period? Should you be focused on the lifetime of your grandchildren? I mean, this makes a huge difference in determining how you would make any given decision, because it is often the case that if you take a longer time frame, you would almost automatically consider a much wider set of players in considering how you make a particular decision. So I want to go back in time a little bit when I start talking about HP, and I want to talk about the so-called DNA for corporate social responsibility at HP. It was the common wisdom and the common talk when I was coming up in my corporate career that if you just built a sense of corporate social responsibility into the DNA of a company, that was all that was needed. The right decisions would be made, the right stakeholders would be considered. And so there are three dimensions of that I want to talk about in terms of HP's background. One is the original thinking about HP's reason for being. And this is often quoted, and many of you have perhaps seen it in 1940, Dave Packard was speaking to a group of CEOs when he said, "Many assume wrongly that a company exists simply to make money. The real reason HP exists is to make a contribution, to improve the welfare of humanity, to advance the frontiers of science. Profit is not the proper end aim of management. It is what makes all the proper ends and aims possible." And through, I would say, the majority of my career at HP, that was largely the sense. Now that also got manifested through the company's corporate objectives. And I want to highlight a couple specifically, because while the list is not necessarily novel, there are many companies that might have similar items on their list of corporate objectives. I think the framing of some of the objectives is somewhat novel, especially in today's world, and also is very related to this concept of who are the rightful stakeholders of the company. So these objectives were first documented in 1958, and I'm not going to highlight them all. I'm just going to highlight a few that I think are particularly significant. First, profit. The specific wording was to achieve sufficient profit, not to maximize profit, to achieve sufficient profit to finance our company growth and provide the resources we need to achieve other corporate objectives. I think that thinking about profit was very significant and very informative in terms of the way people made decisions. Fields of interest. To participate in those fields of interest that offer opportunities for continuing growth and that enable us to make a needed and profitable contribution. So in deciding what businesses do we go in, how do we expand, those were the kinds of decisions that were made. Our people. To help HP people share in the company's success, which they make possible, and to help them gain a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment from their work. And finally, citizenship. To honor our obligations to society by being an economic, intellectual, and social asset to each nation and each community in which we operate. And I think that view that it was the role of the leadership team at HP to ensure that the company really was an asset, that people embraced HP as a company coming to their community or their country because of the many things that HP would bring, not just in terms of paying taxes and offering jobs, but in terms of actively contributing to the welfare of the community. So I would say that in terms of stakeholders, and I'm going to get into this in more detail, but during the Bill and Dave era, if you ask someone who are the stakeholders, they would mention 4 groups. And I've used different type size to indicate who really got the most significant weight during different periods of the company's history. In the early days, employees and customers, followed by communities and investors, were clearly viewed as the stakeholders. Wall Street was not so powerful. Quarterly earnings calls were not happening when this company was founded. Hewlett-Packard always owned a big piece, and even when, in theory, they needed to be paying more attention to their investors, it just wasn't their way of being in the world. Employees were always huge because there was a real view of partnership in building the success of the company. And I think all of the reward strategies, the benefit programs and approaches, as well as the way people were managed, reflected that, the kind of leeway people had to make a difference. You see some of that now reflected in some new companies like Google, things like giving people a lot of discretionary time to go off and pursue ideas that they find interesting that are not dictated top-down. Those kinds of things were pioneered very, very early on at HP. During the transition period, and I'm referring to the transition period as the time between Hewlett and Packard being actively involved in any way, and even at the time that they were beginning to fail, even if they weren't completely gone, to the recent period, so the post-Carly era. There were still family members on the board. There still was a lot of legacy of HP during those interim years, and that really was the end of my involvement at HP. Investors definitely started to be the number one focus of priority. Employees were losing a little ground. I would say it was investors followed by customers. Employees and community were still up there. And then under the Mark Hurd era, there was another very significant shift with employees being almost treated as a necessary evil. Obviously, HP is a big company. It's very decentralized, so you can find exceptions to this in particular organizations within the company. But if you look at what happened to employee benefit programs and what happened to the overarching corporate level approaches to employees, very significant change in that era. Investors became even more of the principal focus. Customers, of course, are a focus because there's a view that you can't succeed if you don't pay some attention to customers, and communities lost a lot of ground. So I want to dive a little bit into that middle era in terms of, okay, we cared about these stakeholders. What did that mean in terms of programs and policies and what we actually did? So I'm going to use this chart. This chart is the global citizenship framework that we use to talk about what does it mean for HP to be a global citizen. It's the way we articulated our field of play, if you will, in terms of global citizenship. And I think very significantly in the center of this chart is ethics and governance. And you may recall that during this period, we had just undergone Enron. We were watching some huge ethical breaches in major companies that were causing significant pain to employees, communities, investors. That was very much on the tongues of people. Ethics had always been a big focus for Hewlett and Packard. Many would say it was too hard to get fired at HP. However, everyone knew that if you committed ethical misconduct, you would get fired. It was just ingrained into the company. Big focus on governance. Sarbanes-Oxley passed. Lots of effort into providing more transparency around all of our governance processes. Community engagement was also a big focus. And to us, community engagement historically and during this period was largely about unleashing employees to work in communities that were co-located with HP facilities. And so those activities ranged from things like individual businesses adopting organizations in their community and donating equipment and donating time and doing volunteer activities. We did a lot of that, particularly in schools throughout the US and more broadly. It also involved more radical activities like some of the e-inclusion stuff that I will talk about, but explicit volunteer policies, giving people paid time off to go and do volunteer work on behalf of the company and really encouraging that was part of the community engagement philosophy. And I think there was a strong view that, and a lot of feedback from employees, that they really valued the company because they felt like the company supported them in doing things that they really cared about in their community, in helping make their community a better place. Philanthropy programs also tried to enable that, encouraging people with matching programs to donate equipment to schools and other nonprofit organizations, as well as to make financial contributions with matching programs. Around the not total outside, but inner outside, were the three main areas of active engagement driven by HP's business and HP's strategy. So one of the very significant things about our thinking about global citizenship was that it should be directly linked to the business strategy of the company, and we treated it that way. When we went through the annual strategic planning process, this was part of it. And we looked at what was happening on the business side and the things that we were trying to accomplish and the vulnerabilities that we were seeing from a competitive perspective, and tried to drive the priorities from a citizenship perspective to be aligned with that. And so the three areas that made sense were privacy, because of our business. Privacy was a big issue. Environment. Environment had been a lifelong focus of the company, partly because Hewlett and Packard were environmentalists, and this was a concern from before the time it was popular to worry about the environment. And finally, inclusion in education. Inclusion was the term that we used to describe using technology to accelerate economic development. And that was probably the area where we were doing the most groundbreaking work. We had two very significant projects, one in Africa, one in South Africa in a rural village near Zimbabwe, and one in Andhra Pradesh in India, where we put significant full-time teams, 20 plus people on the ground, to work in collaboration with the local community, with government, and with nonprofit organizations to try to really figure out how technology could accelerate development in those communities. Really interesting things came out. The strategy was both a community contribution strategy and a business development strategy. We looked at these rural developing parts of the world and said, there are a lot of people who, if we could give them technology that was really suited to their environment and their specific needs at a price that made sense given the value, then it's a big business opportunity. And obviously it was also an opportunity to have an impact in terms of global development. So I want to talk a little bit about stakeholder engagement in these areas, and I want to come back to a couple comments that were made during a little tail end after I came in. Our strategy was to actively engage even with some fringe stakeholders. And so in the area of environment, as an example, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition had always been a little on the sort of guerrilla warfare side of the equation, and we had been in their sights. We were a big organization. We make a lot of stuff, and they had some significant concerns about that. And we decided, we didn't know where this is going to go, but we're going to sit down and talk to these guys, because for a variety of reasons, we believed that part of what pisses these organizations off is being just dismissed, being treated as though they're not even worth a conversation. And so we sat at the table and had dialogue and tried to understand their perspective and tried to help them understand ours. And I would say in every case, and we engaged with lots of organizations, in every case, it moved the ball forward in a positive way. We didn't always agree, but never did it backfire. You said, well, maybe they would be more angry because they made a suggestion and you didn't follow up on it. If we could rationally explain why we were doing what we were doing and not doing what they thought the best idea was, it was always the case that they felt less hostile towards us for having engaged. They didn't necessarily love us, and they didn't necessarily get out there and say, Yahoo, these guys are the greatest thing that ever happened to the environment. But they valued the being listened to. And when we genuinely listened to them, it always worked. I think if you engage with people in a way that's condescending and dismissive, it can really backfire. And so the intent and the manner have to be authentic, but our experience was always very positive there. Our engagement in the inclusion communities was very broad and very interesting, partly because we were learning a ton. We were engaging with all kinds of organizations, big development organizations like the UN, and little nonprofit organizations working in Africa doing all kinds of things, or working in India doing all kinds of things. They had different agendas for us. Some of them, just thought, oh, these guys have a lot of money, they can give it to us. But that was a giant opportunity to learn about what was happening in those environments from a radically different perspective. The outside of this triangle is basically the levers that we used, primary levers that we used in going after these various issue areas. So we had a big policy team. We did government work around the world. And this is another area where engaging with fringe organizations was very helpful. I mean, we would sometimes collaborate on trying to come up with policy in the environmental area, as an example, that would address environmental concerns. And we were pretty aggressive in the environmental area, so we actually wanted to raise the bar on regulation. We felt that competitively we would be better served. We would prefer to have a more level playing field. And so in our regulatory work, we did a lot of engagement with activist groups and other sometimes fringe kinds of groups. We used philanthropy very strategically, and that was, I think, a very significant part of our strategy. So the idea of just giving out money randomly to people because giving away money is something companies should do didn't make sense to us. Our philanthropy budget, which at the time was about $50 to $60 million a year, it wasn't huge. It went into two buckets. One was employee engagement. I mentioned encouraging employees to give equipment, to give money, and doing matching. And the other was strategic initiatives in the areas that I've talked about. Other than that, we minimized giving away money for the kinds of things that companies often give money for, a benefit here, a little random scattershot investments. And communication was also another key area, a lot of disclosure, extensive reporting, really trying to raise the bar on transparency. So I want to come back to the chart that I showed about changing weight of what stakeholders got paid attention to. And I want to reflect just a little bit on some of why I think the weight shifted. Some is obvious, maybe all of it's obvious to you, some perhaps not so obvious. Obviously, the death of the founders had a big influence, and my husband and I now, when we drive past HP, say, that's why you should never name a company after yourself, because you just don't know, and you might be mortified. Clearly, that was a major factor. Wall Street has a lot more influence today than they had 60 years ago. This obsession with quarterly earnings that just drives a lot of management teams just wasn't so much the reality. And I think that serves not only to raise the focus on investors, but also to drive this short-term view that's very negative from a number of perspectives. HP's been globalized for a long, long time, but I think with increasing globalization comes a sense of detachment from the community of corporate leaders. So, when HP started, it was a little Palo Alto company. And Bill and Dave were significant members of the community here. They served on the school board, they had kids in school. Their multiple identities all came together in this environment. They were businessmen, yes, trying to run a successful business, but they were also community leaders and sportsmen and environmentalists and activists. And when I reflect on the history of HP and I reflect on the state of business today, one of the things that I lament is what I would generally call disintegration. I think that somewhat uniquely for their time, Hewlett and Packard embraced their multiple identities in the way they led the company. And because of that, it was very natural for them to think HP should worry about the environment. They cared about the environment. They wanted to be able to be in clean air, in beautiful, pristine places, fishing and doing the kinds of things they loved to do. They knew about government. They participated in government at the local level. Ultimately, Dave took a leave of absence and was assistant deputy at the national level. They viewed themselves as more of a part of multiple arenas of society. And that's true to some extent today, but I think more rare. I think it's more typical to embrace Friedman's view that companies make as much money as they can possibly make and don't worry about the rest of that stuff. Somebody else will worry about it, which is a very disintegrated approach. The last point up here is rising consumerism. Consumers play in this shift as well. It was not so much the case in the 30s when HP started that consumers were pretty single-mindedly fixated on getting more for less. They were focused on other things, and they were buying from smaller organizations for the most part, and so they could pay attention to the impact that a company had, both through their product, but through the way they showed up in the community and the kinds of things they did. There were more natural checks and natural balances in that system. So Chris asked me to reflect, before I open this up to a little Q&A, on what would it take to solve the big social and environmental problems of our time. And this is certainly something that I spend a lot of energy on now. I doubt that I will ever go back into the corporate world in any full-time way. Been there, did that. Great experience. And now I'm really focused on trying to have an impact in a couple of ways. The construct of business is a great concern to me, and so I'm active in B-Lab, which you'll learn more about, trying to create a new business sector. I'm very involved in social entrepreneurs, in trying to bring some of the tools of business and entrepreneurship to people who are single-mindedly focused on trying to change the world. That's where I spend my time. And having the business background that I have and believing that business is absolutely essential. We will never, ever, ever, ever address the big social environmental issues of our time without having business squarely engaged in helping to address those issues. I synthesized my thoughts about what it will take into this little 2x2 because after going to Harvard, my brain is pretty much a 2x2. I don't know if you're all undergoing that same re-engineering of your brain. But I think there are two dimensions that need to shift. One is the time frame of consideration. I think this is true at the individual level. I also think it's true at the organizational level, particularly for businesses. So we need to start thinking longer term. But I also think we need to shift from thinking about impact only at the individual level or the individual company level, more in the direction of thinking about impact on communities, society, the planet, and the inhabitants. That's much more complicated. That is moving much more in the direction of a very interconnected view, the integrated approach to thinking about decisions that I mentioned as being part of the hallmark of the way Hewlett and Packard approached their role as business leaders. And I think the good news about taking that perspective is, while it's hard, it's so much easier to focus on one thing. Every day, life would be really easy if you could just focus on one thing. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's very gratifying to segment your life into these disconnected buckets. When you're in the community, you're one way, and when you're in business, you're another way, and it's just kind of not all that gratifying. So making this transition, while difficult, I think leads to more overall satisfaction when one can achieve it, which is always another good thing to aspire to. So with that, let me open the floor and take questions about things that might have been intriguing to you.
Wait, before. So I just have to talk and say thank you to our YouTube viewers, and we'll see you possibly in another 2 weeks. Thank you. Now we can have questions.
Okay.
Can you go back, because it was hard to read one slide.
Yes.
And I'll just write it up here so we see it.
Oh, you want to see this slide?
Yeah, so
oh, you can't see the middle.
No.
It's ethics and governance on the top, community engagement